Hey, what's up guys? My name's Ryan Talbot, and today I'm going to be showing you how to create this animation. So we'll be starting off by using an X-particle system to create the leaf animation. Then I'll show you how I built the environment using Octane Render, Forester, and a couple of Quixel maps. And then to finish off, I'll show you a breakdown of the compositing phase. Alright, let's get into it. One thing to note about this tutorial is that it does require X-particles. I'm using version 4, but as long as you have that trigger action object, you should be good to go. So the first thing that I need to do is I need to get some motion capture animation. So I just head to mixamo.com, and as long as you have an Adobe subscription, you should be able to log in and access all these characters and animations. So the animation that I used was called Looking Around. And I just used the regular, I believe this is the Y-bot. And so I'm just going to download this animation as is. As an FBX, I'll go with 60 frames per second and download that. So once that's downloaded, you're going to want to take that and drag it into Cinema 4D as a new file. And if you play that back, you have your motion capture animation all ready to go. The next step is to export this as an Alembic file. So I'm just going to go up to File, Export Alembic. And the reason for doing this is X-particles won't see this regular animation unless it's exported as an Alembic sequence. It might work as an OBJ sequence too, I'm not too sure, but in this case I'm using Alembic. Let's create a new Cinema 4D file, and let's create an X-particles system. So in the same file, let's reopen our Alembic. So I'm going to drag my Alembic in here, hit OK, and then we don't need any of this nonsense because this is just a bunch of nulls that got baked down. This was our skeleton, but we don't need that anymore. So I'm just going to put that in a null and call this Looking Around .abc so that we know it's an Alembic sequence. So I'm going to copy this over into our X-particles file, and I'm going to save this before we continue. So under the emitter tab, let's change our emitter to a circle, and let's change the emitter plane to Y, and we can scale this up as well, something like that. And under emission, let's uncheck emit all frames, and let's change it from 0 to 1 so that the leaves generate on the first frame, and then whatever we have is just whatever plays through in the rest of the animation. I'm going to pump up that birth rate to somewhere around 100,000, and we're going to decrease the speed to 100 with a variation of 100. And if we play that back, we should get something like this. Alright, cool. So now we're going to add a crap ton of modifiers to make this do what we want, which is first, we want all these to be attracted to our animation and cover him up, and then we want them to, with a fall off, blow away into the wind. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a motion modifier. We're going to go and find cover/target. Now the target object is going to be Looking Around.abc. So we'll just connect that, and let's see. Now all of our particles are attracted, and we can turn off our original Alembic animation and see that it is still working, and we get something like that. So now let's adjust our cover settings so that they all kind of swarm towards him faster. So I'm going to change the speed mode from use particle speed to gravity, and change that gravity strength to 5. Let's see what that looks like. Much better. The next modifier I want to add is turbulence. So we can tune in our turbulence settings later on, but this will be a good start. So the next modifier is going to be a control modifier, and that is going to be a trigger action modifier. So we're going to drag this down just so that everything is in order. I'm going to make my cover first, then turbulence, and then trigger action. And this trigger action is basically going to enable these first two modifiers. So let's make sure our fall off is set to infinite. And then let's go down to modifiers, and we can actually lock this panel in place so that we can select these two and then drag them into our modifiers to affect particles. It's just ensuring that these two modifiers are working from the get-go, but the reason we need to set this up is because we're going to add a second trigger action which will tell it to stop covering this object, and that's only going to work if we have this first trigger action telling it to cover the object. So let's add that second trigger action modifier. So let's go back up to modifiers. Oh, and let's unlock this window. Now let's go up and we'll add another trigger action. Trigger action not one. We'll call this one stop covering. We're going to change the fall off of this from sphere to linear. And then let's rotate this 90 degrees, actually 180. There we go. And let's keyframe it from the top. Or maybe let's wait until all these particles settle in, and then we'll set a keyframe here. And then we'll go about 20 frames forward, and we'll keyframe that right there. So now what we need to do is let's go to our stop covering trigger action. Let's go to the modifiers tab. We'll lock this window in, and we will tell it to stop covering this object by putting our XP cover in our modifiers to not affect particles. And now if we play this back, we should get something like this. Boom. So now he gets covered in particles, and then he gets wiped away into nothing. Cool. So that's a good start. And that's basically the basis of our effect. Pretty simple. Okay, so there's a few more modifiers I need to add. The first one is wind, and we want all these modifiers to kick in when our cover action turns off. So let's go up to our modifiers, and let's go to motion modifiers, and we're going to add wind. Let's drag that in between our two action triggers, and then we'll go and we'll put in a drag, and then finally we'll put in gravity. Okay, so I'm going to go to my stop covering, and let's lock this window once again, and we're going to drag all three of these modifiers into our modifiers to affect particles window. So now when this fall off comes down, it's going to activate all three of these modifiers at once. So let's turn off these two and just focus on our wind for now. I'm going to just rotate my wind 90 degrees, maybe move it off to the side so we can see a little bit better, and then rotate it so that it's blowing kind of at an angle. And I don't remember the exact values, so I'm just going to hop over to my actual project file for this, and we're just going to copy over the values from there. So our wind was set to 750. So I'm going to input that here. Everything else is set to default. And so now it blows away. Cool. So now let's go into our drag, and I remember this was set to human upright, density custom, and let's see what that density was. So I had the density set to 25. So let's input that there, and let's see what that's doing. Before the drag was implemented, these particles are kind of exploding everywhere, and it was kind of insane. So I put that drag in there just so that they just kind of float off as opposed to exploding. So now we have our gravity, and let's enable that, and let's see what settings I have for that. So I had that set to 301. Everything else looks good. So let's copy that in here, and now let's see what that looks like. Cool. So it's still not looking quite right. So we need to adjust our turbulence, which is still active. Remember, we never shut off the turbulence from the beginning, so it's still affecting those particles as they float away. So let's go check our turbulence settings, and I had the scale set to 291, the noise type was turbulence, and the strength was 506. So let's make sure we have all those settings. So let's change our noise type, scale. Okay, and let's see what that gives us. Cool. So that's looking a lot closer to what I want. Now, one more thing I'm going to adjust real quick is I noticed when I hit play, there is still some particles that kind of buzz around him before the fall off happens. So I'm going to go into our XP cover, and I'm going to crank up the acuteness of turn. And I think that will fix our issue so that these particles just kind of snap into place. And there you go. I'm going to adjust the fall off keyframes a little bit. As you can see, I already slowed down the keyframes a bit. So if I hit Shift F3, that'll bring up the timeline window. And just for the sake of being able to see what I'm doing, I'll dock it right here. And I'll adjust this. So let's go back to the beginning and delete this first keyframe. And I want it to start more off to the side. And I want it to be rotated. So I want it to sort of come down at an angle. So let's create a keyframe there. And then maybe move this over here. Create another keyframe. Boom. And maybe we'll have something like that. Alright, cool. Alright guys, the next step is to create our leaves and our environment. So I head to Quixel.com for this, and I used some of their scans for both the leaves and the ground environment. It does cost $19.99 a month, but there's actually a free section on here too, where you can get some cool assets like branches, this concrete, these rocks. Yeah, so you can go download some of these things for free too, and definitely don't feel like you have to use this either. There's plenty of other websites out there, one like cgtextures.com, and if you search on here, I bet you can find some leaf materials, some leaves. Yeah, there you go. So I'm just going to show you what I used. This is the leaf map that I ended up going for. So I'm just going to drag this over here and quickly build an Octane material and start plugging in these maps. So all we really need is the color map and the opacity. So I'm just going to plug these in real quick, just dragging and dropping. And bada boom, bada bing. Alright, so let's double click to update that material. Name this leaves. And let's just drop a plane in here real quickly and up the segments to something like 30 and 30. Head over to display, change that to Groove shading so we can see that. And let's put our texture on there. So the reason I upped the segments a little bit is if you go into your top view and then change display to Groove shading lines, hit C to make that plane editable, we're going to start separating these into the different leaves. So I got my rectangular selection tool, and I'm just going to select these right here, hit UP, and now if I turn off this plane, you can see we have our first leaf right here. And let's head into our perspective so you can see that a little bit better. Boom, there it is. So just make sure you select enough polygons so that you're not cutting off the leaf. I'll go back to my plane, select the next set, hit UP, and you see that's creating new objects. Go to the next one, hit UP, and then pretty much just repeat that process. So when you're done, you should end up with something like this. And we can actually delete our original plane altogether. And if you feel like being organized, you can select all these, go down to Tools, Naming Tool, and let's replace the word plane with leaf. Boom. So now let's copy all these over to our other project. So I'm just going to Control C, head on over, and we need to create a generator object so we can replace these dots with our leaves. So let's go down to generators and choose just a regular old generator. And I'm going to paste all our leaves in here and move them underneath the generator, like so. And if you play it back, you still see dots, and that's because we did not choose an emitter. So let's choose our XP emitter, and now we have all of our leaf cards in there. But the problem is they're all laying flat, and we want them to be rotating in different directions. So let's head over to our XP generator, and under Scale Rotation and Offset, let's change Particle Rotation to set rotation, and I'm going to change everything here to 360, including the variation. So now, if we reset this animation and play it again, you can see all of our cards are facing completely different directions. And the next thing I want to change is the scale of these leaves because they're way too big right now. So let's go into our XP emitter and change the radius to something like 3. So another really important note is when you change this radius to 3, it's going to affect the scale of all of these modifiers. So now you see when I play this back, we're getting some pretty crazy stuff when that fall off comes down. So in order to compensate for changing the particle radius, you need to go into your drag, and we need to up the force multiplier to 1000. So now if we play that back, it should look okay. And one last thing you're going to want to do before we cache this is we're going to want to drop a plane in here and then scale it up and then apply an XP collider tag to it. That way we just make sure none of our particles pass through the floor and they just collide with it instead. So why don't we pause this and let's actually do a quick cache. So under other objects, let's add our cache object right here, and we're going to just hit build cache. Cool. So now that we have a cache, we can scrub through our animation and see what the whole thing is going to look like. Let's head into our Octane viewer and preview that. And now we can start building the leaf material. So the first thing I want to do is get a sunlight in here so that we have something to base our material off of, other than just nothing. So we'll just rotate that, maybe have it come in at an angle. I'm going to actually duplicate this material, and we're going to name this one Leaves Glossy, and this one Leaves Transmission. So for transmission, let's copy our diffuse and paste it in the transmission tab. And now in the transmission tab, I'm going to boost the brightness up to something like 3, because we're also going to mix this. And now I'm going to create a mix material. So I'm going to combine our transmission with our glossy material. And now if I go into glossy, let's actually make it glossy. So go in here, can increase the roughness and maybe also increase the index a little bit. And let's plug in our normal map for this as well. So I'm pulling up the glossy material, and then I'm going to pull up my leaf map, and I'm just going to drag in my normal map right here and plug this in. And there we go. And I might as well plug in our specular map while we're at it too. So now we have this Octane mix material, and let's lean it more towards the transmission side, and I'll rename this Leaves Mix 1, and under our XP generator, swap out that material onto all these. Alright, so now that we have our main animation set up, why don't we go and build the environment, and then we can come back and tweak these leaf materials even more. Alright, so I've hopped into a new Cinema 4D file, and one thing to note before we continue is I am using another plugin called Forester for Cinema 4D. You can check it out here on 3dquakers.com, but once again, don't feel like you have to use a paid plugin, because you can also go on TurboSquid and search free tree, and there's all these things you can download here for free. So I'll start by making a new plane, and let's also grab an Octane scatter object and a Forester tree. So the tree I want to choose under tree library is the aspen tree, and then I'm going to scale up my plane quite a bit, and we're going to drag our aspen tree underneath that Octane scatter. And we want to set our distribution to surface, and we want that surface to be our plane, which I will also rename floor. So now we have aspen trees everywhere, and there's way too many of them. So let's decrease our number to 500. And that's a little bit better. Let's go down even more to 300. And now we want each tree to have its individual rotation, because you can see there's a bit of what looks like tiling going on. So let's go up to our Octane scatter, and let's go down to rotate. And I'm going to set this to 360. And then under shader, let's put a noise in there. And then decrease the scale to something like 1%. And now each tree has different rotation. I'm going to up the contrast a little bit more, so just to make the effect even more dramatic. And now let's go do the same thing with our scale. So I'm going to stick a noise in our scale, and boom, that should be fine. You could even scale down the noise. Let's do something like 10% maybe. And it's just going to look a little bit more random that way. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drop in a daylight. And now let's rotate our daylight. Something like that maybe. Before we continue, I'm also going to note that I'm using path tracing instead of direct lighting. So if you see when I switch this to direct, you can see how the lighting changes dramatically, and it's not very accurate compared to path tracing. There's a lot you can read up on why path tracing looks better, but basically it calculates all these different light bounces and global illumination from all these the colors of the leaves, and it takes a lot more things into account than direct lighting does, and you can see how drastic of a difference that is right there. Alright, so I'm going to turn down the max samples to something like 500, because we don't need that many samples just to preview this. And let's bring in our ground texture. So for the ground, I'm using another Quixel map. It's called Ground Forest 8K, and it looks like that. So I'm just going to make a new Octane diffuse material and open up that node editor and start dragging in our maps. So we got our diffuse, got our displacement. Come over to our displacement tab, hit add displacement, plug that in. Got roughness. We got our normal map. And then we're going to have to change this to a glossy material to enable the specular channel. And let's drag in our specular. And just to clean this up a little bit, you can select everything, go up to view, auto arrange selected, and now everything's nice and organized. So I'm going to rename this ground and then drag it onto our ground. Now I'm going to come over to the material, and I'm going to scale this down to something like 10%, and that looks pretty good. And the next thing I'm going to do is bring in an HDRI map. So we're going to go down to Objects, HDRI Environment, and I'm going to go to my handy dandy HDRI folder and use this one, which I found on Google Maps a while ago. It's my favorite HDRI to use, and we're not seeing it because we need to go over to our daylight and enable mixed sky texture. That way we're seeing both the daylight and our HDRI map at the same time. So let's head over to our HDRI, and because it's a JPEG, we need to adjust our gamma from 1 to 2.2. And you can see how it got a lot darker right there. So now the key here is to really just come in here with your camera and find a nice composition in this forest. Now, I think I'm actually going to scale up my floor even more. And let's turn up the number of aspen trees in our Octane scatter. Let's double it. Okay, so a couple more things. The first thing is the scene feels very dark and dull to me. It doesn't feel like a daylight scene. So what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to pump up the power of our daylight to 4. And it's going to look kind of overexposed at first. But now you can see even the shadowy areas are brighter. The background is blown out. But one thing we can do to sort of bring back those shadows but keep this light look is by adding more trees. So let's go to our Octane scatter and up it to something like 1,000. And another thing that I forgot to mention before is that I need to change my displacement settings. So on the ground texture, let's up this to something like 60 and change the detail level to 2048 and the mid-level to 0.5. And now we're getting some nice displacement on the floor. We can zoom in there and kind of check it out. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is add some variation in the color of these leaves. So let's take our leaf material and let's convert it to an Octane material first. And then one handy tool is to go up to Function and remove unused materials. And that way, if you just convert a lot of materials at once, you can delete them all with that shortcut. So I'm going to come into my leaf material here, and I'm going to add a color correction node. And now what you can do with this is you can come in here and adjust the hue. So if I want the leaves to be red, all I have to do is shift the hue to the left, or if I want the leaves to be yellow, I can shift it a little bit to the right. So why don't we make a yellow version, and we'll duplicate this 2 more times, and we'll keep one at the original color, and then we'll make this third one leaning towards the red side. Maybe something like that. Cool. So now we have all these different gradations of color. So how can we apply this? Well, let's duplicate our aspen tree in the Octane scatter object, and let's just swap out this leaf material on each one. So now if we look around, we can see that we're getting some variation, although I think I'm seeing too many yellow trees. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to duplicate this middle aspen tree, and that should give us more orange trees. Give that a second. Cool, so now you can see there's some red, and there's some orange, and there's some yellow as well. Now the next thing I want to do is add some leaves scattered all around the ground as if they've been falling from these trees. So I'm going to hop on over to my other project file, and I'm going to grab these leaves right here. So let's just copy these over. And we'll paste these all in. And let's add another Octane scatter, and we can even rename it leaves if we want to. And let's just drag all these underneath that hierarchy. Cool. And now let's change vertex to surface and select our plane. And now we have some leaves. We can up the count to maybe something like 10,000. And let's go down to scale and let's add in a noise in here. Now these leaves are looking too big, so you can just select these original objects and scale them down, and that should scale them down in the Octane scatter as well. So one problem I'm noticing with these leaves is that there's some very strange intersecting happening here because of the displacement on our ground floor. We're not seeing the opacity channel come through. Instead, we're seeing the white border. To explain a little bit better, or just show you, if I turn off the displacement, you can see how these cards are intersecting with the plane. So what we want to do is in our leaf scatter is just change the position to something like 2, which will raise our leaf texture slightly above that plane and get rid of that intersection problem. So if we turn our displacement back on, we should not be seeing those artifacts. There's still maybe a tiny bit going on, but from the camera angle that we're going to be setting up, you're not going to see any of that. Alright, I'm thinking these leaves are still maybe a little bit too big, so I'm going to scale them down some more. And let's turn up the number to 1500, or sorry, 15,000. And scale it down a little bit more. Turn up the number. So now what we want to do is we want to match the color of these leaves to the ones that are on the trees. So we're going to do a similar technique. So I'm going to duplicate this mix material twice. Rename this one mix 2. Rename this one mix 3. And let's also duplicate our leaves transmission a couple times. And we're going to do the same thing and add a color correction node to these. and we're going to shift the hue. But shifting the hue isn't really doing enough. So what we're also going to do is up here in the color channel, let's mix in some orange. Maybe something like that. And then down here, we're going to mix our color correction node with the straight color. And now you can see the color is changing. And the more we slide it over, the more orange we get in that material. So why don't we come back into our color correction, and let's also adjust the brightness. Let's try something like 3. And let's just keep adjusting the hue until we get something we like. Alright, so I'm finding that this is a good hue right here that's kind of matching the color. So now I'm going to desaturate it a little bit to something like 0.7. And now that's matching the trees pretty well. Okay, and one last thing we want to do, if we open up our node editor, we can see that we have a separate image texture being piped into the transmission than what's being put into the diffuse, and only the diffuse is being color corrected. So let's delete this second one, and let's make sure our color correction is also being piped into the transmission tab. That way, we don't have duplicate nodes, and if we update our color correction here, it will update in both the diffuse and the transmission. So now let's update our mix materials, and we'll select our leaves transmission 2, and then we'll select our leaves transmission 3. Alright, so I've gone ahead and I've updated my other transmission and mix materials. So I basically did the same thing, but you can see in this one I mixed in a little yellow, and in this one I mixed in a little bit of red. So they all have slightly different color variations. So now I'm just going to go through and I'm going to update the materials here in the scatter object. And I suspect we'll be editing these materials furthermore once we get our X particles animation in here, because we're going to be seeing that again in a different light. Okay, so I went ahead and I found my composition in this forest, and I decided that this is going to be the spot, this is going to be my framing. So I'm going to add an Octane camera, and then I'm going to add in a null. And let's take our null and let's reposition it where we want our X particles system to be. We want it to be center of frame, and if we go to our null settings, we can also change the display to something like a cube and set the orientation to XY, and now we'd have a better idea of where that is in 3D space. So if we want our X particles dude to be somewhere right here, we can rename this center null. And now I'm going to create a second null, and we're going to name this one environment. And this is just going to help me keep things organized. So I'm going to drag everything into my environment null. That way when we drop this into our other project file, it's not so confusing. So let's drop our center null into here too. And then I'm just going to hit Control-C, and let's bring this over. I'm going to delete this existing Octane daylight because we have our own daylight now. And then we're going to paste this in, and let's enable our camera so we can go back to that spot. And we're going to drag our X particle system underneath the center null, and then reset that position to 0. And we might also have to rotate it 90 degrees. So let's do that. But now if we refresh our live viewer, we get this, which looks awful and completely different. And that's because we need to change this back to path tracing. And now it looks beautiful again. So let's turn down the samples to 500. And why don't I scrub a little bit later on to a spot where the man is fully formed so we can see what that looks like. And why don't I adjust my camera a little bit. I'm going to pause this, and then maybe we'll move it up a little bit so it's a little bit closer. Maybe something like that. All right, so before we continue, I'm just going to hit Shift V really quick and go to my view, and I'm going to change the opacity from 10% to 100. That way we're not seeing any unnecessary stuff, and it's easier to line up our composition. So now let's go and let's update our leaf materials. So we have the correct leaf materials on the ground, but we need to update them in our particle system. So let's just select all these and delete them. I'll go to Function, Remove Unused Materials, and then I'm going to drop these in. And now let's refresh our viewer. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little light into here. So I'm going to go up to Options, turn off Check Camera. That way I can light my scene a little bit easier. And let's go in here and get out of the camera view. And I'm going to create a new targeted area light. So I'm going to drag this underneath the center null. And I'm actually going to move my center null out of the environment null. Keep those separate. And let's reposition the target light null to 0. And let's grab our actual light right here. And let's move it. And now we're getting some nice side light in there. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the light tag, and let's turn the temperature down to something like 4500. And that'll give us a nice warm look, as if it were daylight coming through. And I'd say we're getting pretty close, guys. I'll show you one thing I did to the light as well, is I put this cube in here, and then I zero out the position, and rotation. And now this cube covers up the light, right? So if I make the cube editable, and this is kind of replicating, a lighting setup in real life, where you would have, it's called barn doors, and that would sort of set the direction of your light. So I figure, well, if it works in real life, why not try and recreate it in Octane? So I'm just gonna fit this kind of to the shape of our light. And now I'm gonna create a black material, just pure black. That way it's not reflecting any white light, which is also kind of what you would get with real barn doors. So let's select the edges here. And then I'm going to scale these in. And that's just going to direct the light onto our subject and sort of avoid that light spilling onto the trees in the background. I'll turn this off for a second. And then I'm going to put this into compare mode, store render buffer. And then we'll turn it back on, and we'll see what difference that's making. So this is with the rig, and this is without. So now you can see we're still getting the same amount of light on our subject, but it's cutting out the light onto these trees in the background. It makes it feel more like this is just a ray of sunlight coming in through the trees than it is an area light that's spilling all around. So next I'm going to create a little camera rig, and I'm going to start off with a circle spline for that. And let's drop it into our center null. And let's just hit PSR. And we'll change our plane to XZ. And I'm going to come out of our Octane camera, and I'm actually going to put our Octane camera underneath the center null as well. And then I want to scale up this circle until it's hitting the position of our current camera. And then I'm going to make it a child of our Octane camera, so I can zero out the Y position and have it perfectly aligned with our current camera setup. And now I will unchild this object. I'm not sure what the correct term is for that. And I'm going to duplicate this Octane camera, and we'll name it animation camera. And I'm going to right click on that and put a target tag on there and an align to spline tag on there. So with the align to spline, we're going to align it to this circle. And you can see now it's lined up. And next, we want to create a target null so that this camera is always facing our X particles system. So we're going to go up here and create a new null, and we'll name it camera target. And let's drag it down in here. We'll hit PSR to center it, and then we're going to bring it up. Let's check the Y position and just copy that over from our animation camera. So now it's on the same plane as our camera, and we're just going to tell this target tag to point at the camera target. So now we can delete our original Octane camera if we want to. And if we look through this camera, we can go to our align to spline tag and we can animate this position. And now our camera is going to dolly around perfectly our subject. But you notice I'm hitting 0% right here in the center. But let's say I want to cross this axis even more. The way I would do that is to rotate my circle 90 degrees, or maybe negative 90 degrees. And now let's take the position and let's turn it up. And now we can freely move across how we want to. So I'll go back to frame 0 and I'll set a keyframe here. And then I'll go to the end of my animation and we'll move the camera around a little bit and we'll set another keyframe there. And now we got a nice rotating camera. So if I hit Shift F3, that'll bring up my timeline, and then I'm going to select my align to spline keyframes, and I'm going to hit linear. That way, the camera movement doesn't ease in, it's a continuous motion throughout the whole shot. And now I'm just going to move our light out of the way real quick. So let me select that and move it back. And now it's just barely in the frame a little bit, so I'll move it back some more. And now we're good. And now I'll go back into my Octane view, and I might need to boost that light a little bit to compensate for it being farther away. So I'll go in here, and let's just try something like 150. And the last thing you're going to want to do before you set up your render is add an Octane object tag onto your XP system, and make sure the motion blur is set to transform/vertex. Then go to your Octane camera, go to the motion blur tab, check that motion blur, and then you're going to want to set a shutter speed of something like 1/60. So here's a quick snapshot of my render settings: 1920 by 1080p, 24 frames per second, and I also go down to project and make sure that my FPS is set to 24 here as well. And then under the save tab, I have a render token set up. When you type $RS, that just means to grab the name of your render setting. So if I name this render setting leaf animation, and I set up my path so that it goes into the sequences folder, and then $RS, $RS, it's going to set up a folder named leaf animation, and then it's going to stick the actual files in that folder and also name them leaf animation. So for example, when I did this render, I set it up so that there's a folder called color nature, and then all in here, it names the files colored nature. So I thought as a bonus, I'd show you a little breakdown of the compositing stage of the render, and this is really when all the colors start to pop out. But the first thing I do before that is I apply a reduce noise filter by Neat Video, and if I zoom into this image, you can see it's kind of grainy because I rendered this at 300 samples. But once I apply this filter, you can see it makes a big difference. And then the second layer I did on top of that is a glow. So you can see what that looks like. And if I solo this layer, you can see it's only highlighting the brighter areas of this image. And then I set that into screen mode. And the effect I'm using for that is FL Glow. So adjusting the gamma here is what controls how much of the image gets the glow and how much does not. So you can see now only the brightest things will glow, and if I increase this further, everything glows equally. And then on top of that, I add some Video Copilot particle assets, so you can see what this looks like by itself. The effect I used on this was a levels, and that just crushes the blacks a little bit, so when I composite it, the only thing that shines through are the actual particles themselves, because I don't want this gray to affect the entire image. So here's what that looks like before levels, and then after. And then on top of that, I have two adjustment layers. The first one is just a levels adjustment to add some contrast back into that image. And if I disable our glow, you can see better what that's doing with the levels adjustment on. And the final adjustment layer I added on top of all this is a hue and saturation filter. And you can see what that's doing immediately. So I masked this off to just the left half of the image, and I just adjusted the hue a little bit to the left so you can see what that's doing. And I just did that because I wanted to add some variation into the color. I think making the left side red also complements the sunlight coming in from the right side. It really makes the light feel directional, as if the reds are more caught in the shadow and the yellow part is brighter because of the sun. And then coming out of that last comp and into this one, I added a handheld shake onto it using the Wiggle-Rama effect in After Effects. So this is with it on, and this is with it off. So you can see the camera movement just feels a little bit more organic that way. And then the final adjustment is a vignette, and that's just because our subject is in the direct center, so it made sense to darken the edges a little bit in this case. Thank you for watching the tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. Feel free to drop a comment if you have any questions. I'll try to get back to you. I'm also pretty active on my Instagram if you message me there. And other than that, I just hope you have a great day, and I'll see you guys next time. Hey, buddy. You want to say hi to the internet?